The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Water slid down the cracked windows of Daniel's apartment, while the city outside moved in a blur of headlights and umbrellas. Inside, silence filled every corner of the room, except for the ticking clock above the kitchen sink. Daniel sat at the small wooden table with both hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. Everything in his life felt unfinished. The bills stacked near the stove, the unanswered messages on his phone, the apology he still could not speak to his younger brother, the prayer he had repeated every night for months without hearing a single answer. "God," he whispered softly, "why do I feel so empty all the time?" No thunder answered him. No voice filled the room, only the quiet dripping of rainwater from the edge of the roof outside. Daniel lowered his head. For years he had believed that strong people were the ones God used. Certain people, fearless people. The kind of people who always knew what to say, always smiled at church, always carried confidence like a shining lantern. But Daniel felt nothing like that anymore. He felt tired, not dramatic tiredness, not the kind people notice, the hidden kind, the kind where even simple conversations drained him, where waking up in the morning already felt heavy, where smiling became work. He looked around his apartment and sighed. The kitchen light flickered. One cabinet door hung slightly crooked. A small crack ran along the side of his favorite ceramic mug. Daniel stared at the mug for a long moment. "I guess we're both broken," he muttered. That night he couldn't sleep, so he pulled on a jacket and walked through the wet streets until he reached the old church at the corner of Maple Avenue. It stayed open late during storms because the pastor believed hurting people often wandered more honestly at night. Inside, only a few candles burned. An elderly janitor named Miriam slowly swept the floor near the front pews. She looked up as Daniel entered. "You look tired," she said gently. Daniel gave a weak laugh. "Is it that obvious?" Miriam leaned the broom against the wall. "Sometimes cracked jars make the most noise when they're empty." Daniel frowned slightly. "I think mine's shattered." She smiled softly. "Then maybe God has more room to fill." Those words followed him into the silence. Daniel sat alone in the third pew, while rain tapped against the stained glass windows. Above the altar hung an old wooden cross worn smooth by time. For the first time in months, Daniel stopped trying to sound impressive in prayer. No polished words, no pretending, just honesty. "I don't know how to keep going," he whispered. "I don't feel strong anymore. I think I've failed too many times." The room stayed quiet, but somehow the silence no longer felt empty. It felt listening. A memory suddenly returned to him from childhood. His mother standing in their kitchen, holding a clay pitcher with a chipped handle. He once asked her why she never threw it away. She had smiled and answered, "Because it still pours." Daniel closed his eyes. Something inside him loosened. Not fixed, not healed instantly, just loosened, like a hand unclenching after holding something heavy too long. The next morning, life was still messy. The bills remained. The loneliness remained. The future was still uncertain. But something small had changed. Daniel stopped measuring himself by how polished he looked. Instead, he began noticing how grace kept showing up in tiny places. A stranger holding the door open when his hands were full. A text from his brother that simply read, "Thinking about you." The warmth of morning sunlight falling across the kitchen counter. The fact that even after all his doubts, he still wanted to pray. Weeks passed. One evening, Daniel volunteered at a small food pantry near his neighborhood. At first, he almost refused because he felt unqualified to help anyone. But the director simply handed him boxes and smiled. "Broken people feed people best," she said. "They understand hunger." Daniel spent hours carrying groceries, listening to stories, helping elderly neighbors load bags into their cars. And strangely, every time he poured kindness into someone else's life, he felt something refilling inside him too. Not because he suddenly became strong, but because he realized the strength was never supposed to come from him alone. One rainy afternoon, a young woman arrived at the pantry holding back tears while balancing a restless little boy on her hip. "I'm sorry," she whispered nervously. "I've never had to ask for help before." Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he gently handed her a bag of groceries and said the words he himself once needed to hear. "There's nothing shameful about being empty. Empty things can still be filled. The woman began to cry quietly, and as Daniel stood there beneath the flickering pantry lights, he understood something for the very first time. God had never been waiting for him to become flawless. God had been working through the cracks all along, through the exhaustion, through the disappointment, through the loneliness, through the ordinary life Daniel kept apologizing for. That night, Daniel returned home and placed the cracked ceramic mug back on the kitchen shelf instead of throwing it away. The crack was still there, but now when light from the window touched it, the fracture glowed softly across the surface like gold. Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe healing did not always mean becoming unbroken. Maybe sometimes healing meant understanding that even cracked vessels can still carry living water. He poured fresh coffee into the mug and stood quietly by the window while rain drifted gently across the city below. And for the first time in a very long while, he no longer felt ashamed of being human. Because somewhere deep in his tired heart, he finally understood this truth. The treasure was never the jar. The treasure was always the one willing to fill it.